we all know the kind of problems that we have had with local media, with national media, with the wire services around the world. I am so frequently asked, what news source do you think is really good? Because I really want to be in touch with what's going on. I no longer read the New York Times, I no longer read the Washington Post, et cetera, et cetera. And JNS, the Jewish News Syndicate, is out of both Israel and the United States, is what I would highly recommend. What's interesting, when my wife and I still lived in Boston, we contributed to a couple of guys who were setting up a news group, and it turns out that wound up being the JNS, the Jewish News Syndicate, which has become so successful and so important as a source of truth coming out of Israel, and also the news here in the United States, so that at least from some angle we can get the truth of what's going on, especially with so many outlets depending on Hamas for their information, which somehow boggles one's mind to depend on that kind of information. But nonetheless, that has been a huge problem and a growing problem in this country, as well as, of course, around the world. Alex Traiman is the CEO of JNS, and he is here to speak this afternoon. He has not gotten here easily. He spent about 4 hours in a big jet on the tarmac at Newark Airport yesterday because of rain. And as he was about to take off, they took him back to the terminal, as we frequently see. And he did not wind up, at least he got here, but he didn't get here till about 11:30 last night. So we bunked him up at the Westin. I hope he enjoyed it there. But he has gone through a lot of trouble to get here. He's the CEO and Jerusalem Bureau Chief of the Jewish News Syndicate and host of Jerusalem Minute, a seasoned Israeli journalist, documentary filmmaker, and startup consultant. He's a smart guy. He's an expert on Israeli politics and U.S.-Israeli relations. He has interviewed top political figures. He will tell you about that, including Israeli leaders, U.S. senators, and national security officials, with insights featured on major networks. What he's going to talk to us about this afternoon, I think, is obviously extremely important. That's why we've asked him to come speak. But we've heard so much, unfortunately, about that occurrence October 7th, almost 2 years ago, a horrible day. But it's really been one of our focuses this summer. What we haven't focused as much on is what's going on in Israel, within the political factions and all of the protest which kind of waxed and waned over the past almost 2 years. So he's going to fill us in on what is going on internally. I adore going to Israel, and we go somewhat frequently. And when I land at the airport, I feel I'm home. It's such a beautiful feeling. And 2 weeks later, when I'm leaving, I'm so pissed off at the politics and stuff going on that I gotta get out of here back to sanity. And of course, I come back to the United States, which is not sanity. But nonetheless, please welcome our guest, Alex Traiman.
Thank you so much, Alan, and my thanks also to Rabbi Mintz. This is a really nice community. Other friends of ours, Doug, and others that are here. I'm really happy to see everybody, and I understand that I'm coming to speak here towards the end, as you mentioned, of a pretty high-profile series. I understand that you recently had Senator John Fetterman and also Douglas Murray, and now you're asking me to come speak after them. It reminds me, about 6 months ago, I spoke to a group of deputy governors from, I think, about 17 states, and I met them at a restaurant in Jerusalem on their trip, and I'm just sitting there waiting. I was supposed to be there at 8, and all of a sudden it's 8:30, it's 8:45. I know they're still coming. They come, they say, "Oh, I'm sorry that we're late. We just came from a meeting with Minister Ron Dermer." I said, "Wait a second, you want me to speak to the group after you just spoke to Ron Dermer, the former ambassador to the United States, member of the War Cabinet, Minister of Strategic Affairs, and one of the most eloquent advocates for Israel in the know on all these issues?" I was thinking, how do I do this? So I said to the group, I said, Ron, as I call him, I said, or Minister Dermer could certainly tell you things that I don't know, but I could tell you things that he can't say. So hopefully, even though there's probably no greater defender of the Jewish people in the media than Douglas Murray, and perhaps there's no greater defender of Israel and the Democratic Party than John Fetterman today, which is, I think, a surprise to a lot of people. Hopefully, I'll be able to give some insights into some things that maybe you haven't heard before, and we can kind of review, what's been going on now that we're a year and 10 months. Now that we're a year and 10 months into this war. So the question is, what did Hamas actually think that they were going to accomplish on October 7th? We know what they did. About 6,000 people crossed the border. They murdered 1,200 people. They injured thousands of others, which people don't even really talk about so much, but very serious injuries. They kidnapped 255 people, many of them living, some of them dead bodies that they took with them from their massacre on October 7th. And, for all the damage that they did, what is Hamas? I mean, they're a terrorist organization. They have 50,000 people. They have 50,000 or so rockets. They have improvised explosive devices. Certainly, we know that they built a very lengthy tunnel system underneath Gaza, which is larger than the New York City subway system. But if you think about it, who are they going up to fight against? I mean, they basically had committed an act of brutality, a massacre so large that the IDF had no choice but to go into Gaza to root out Hamas and also to find and rescue their hostages. Now, on day one of the war, Israel mobilized 350,000 troops, okay? The IDF is one of the world's most technologically advanced and battle-ready militaries. We have F-35s, F-16s, Apache helicopters, precision-guided weaponry, surveillance technology, intelligence, which begs the question of how did we miss what was happening on October 7th? But that's a whole other question. Maybe we'll get to that in the question and answers. But you can understand just from what I told you that there was really no chance that Hamas could defeat the IDF on the physical battlefield. And even if Hezbollah would have come in on day one of the war, and they could have probably overrun Israel and maybe killed 5,000, 10,000 people had they done so that day, which is one of the great miracles of this war, that Hezbollah, which had a plan, and the Prime Minister discussed how they discovered that there was a plan for Hezbollah and the Houthis and Iran all to bombard Israel simultaneously, which they expected could have been a death blow for Israel. But there's not really any way that a terror organization like Hamas could defeat the IDF on the battleground over time. It's not possible. So, how do they expect to defeat a country so powerful like the state of Israel. Exactly. That's why we're here today. And we saw it 10 days into the war. There was all of a sudden the headlines that I, as a journalist, and my staff and everybody else was afraid could have happened at any point. And it only took 10 days, which is IDF bombs a hospital and kills 500 people. We're talking about the Ali Hospital in central Gaza. And everybody's hearts just dropped when they saw that. And we're trying to figure out, how do we deal with this? And, we were already operating on no sleep for 10 days. And I was going through numerous channels because information was flying left and right. And I'm starting to see that people are suggesting that maybe the IDF was not responsible for this bombing. So, I get on my chat in real time with the chief spokesperson of the IDF, and simultaneously I'm chatting with the senior advisor to the prime minister, and I'm asking them, I said, am I hearing that maybe Israel's not responsible for this bombing? Can you give me a statement that you did not do this? And they said, well, we're working on it. I said, well, while you're working on it, this headline is flying around the world. We have BBC, CNN, New York Times, AP, Reuters, all reporting that you bombed the hospital and killed 500 people, so please give me a statement. And you're saying, well, I'm working on it. I said, you don't have time to work on it. I said, just give me a statement, do your little investigation, and then in the morning, if it turns out that you did it, you could turn around and say, well, we did an investigation, it turns out that we did do it. But meanwhile, get me a statement right now saying that you didn't do it. And they said, well, Alex, we can't do that. And I said, why can't you do it? And they said, well, we're a democracy, and we're not a terrorist organization. And when we give information to other countries, those countries expect that we're giving them accurate information. So we're not going to undercut our own reliability factor by giving information that we can't guarantee. And meanwhile, you can only imagine how many points of fire they were checking on radio contact as you're doing air campaign, artillery, and from the sea, firing in Gaza in all different directions. There's radar, there's surveillance footage, there was phone calls that they were surveilling also. But sure enough, as I pushed them to get me the statement as soon as possible, I had our news editor already prepare the article because I understood that there's a good chance that I'm going to get a statement soon from the IDF and the Prime Minister's office that Israel didn't do this. And I said, prepare that article on the basis of Israel not having done it. Just wait. I'm going to get you statements. And the second I get you that statement, you just plug it in and you hit publish. And so sure enough, I did get statements from the Prime Minister's office and from the IDF even before they had tweeted them out. And JNS was the first media organization to publish that the IDF was not responsible for that bombing on October 17th. Now, as we know, it wasn't the IDF, it was a Palestinian Islamic Jihad rocket that was fired as part of a salvo of long-range missiles toward Haifa aimed at civilian population centers inside Israel. One of those rockets, you could see it in the video, it takes like one of these left turns. It crashes down inside Gaza, but it doesn't hit the hospital. It hits the parking lot outside of the hospital. In the morning, you could see the front of the hospital with the shrapnel marks on the facade of the hospital. And because it had hit the parking lot of that hospital at about 1:45 it's not possible that 500 people would have been killed in that attack. I work in the industry of journalism, and we're always taught that the most important part of the article is the lead. What composes the lead? It's the 5 W's and the H: the who, what, when, where, why, and how. And interesting to note that the New York Times, the BBC, CNN, AP, Reuters, Guardian, the publications that we would consider to be the largest and the most reputable media publications in the world, collectively all ran with the headline, and not one of them bothered to call up the hospital, call up a source that they had. They just ran with the headline that the IDF bombed the hospital and killed 500 people. And do you think that they made corrections when it came out that Israel did not bomb the hospital? When you go home after this event and you're a little bit bored later, you just type into Google, the date was October 17th, and you write IDF bombs hospital, kills 500, you will see countless articles today about how the IDF bombed the hospital in the Gaza Strip and killed 500 people. And if you add the word Reuters to that search, and you could do this with AP or CNN, but if you do it with the word Reuters, you're not going to find the article that they have about the IDF bombing the hospital and killing 500 people. You're going to see a whole series of probably close to 24 articles about how the IDF bombed the hospital and killed 500 people and what everybody and their cousins said about it and the aftermath of that. And that's today, a year and 10 months later. So you understand then that the strategy of Hamas was actually to defeat Israel in the battle for legitimacy. You know, this is something that the Prime Minister has talked about as being the eighth front, because he's talking about a war, you know, against Gaza, against Hezbollah, in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Iran, in Judea and Samaria. You know, and this seventh front is the media front. But for Hamas, for Qatar, the funders of Hamas, this was the first front of the war. And it's not just the media. You see how they also use the international agencies. It wasn't just a few months later where the International Court of Justice is trying Israel on cases of genocide. That case brought by South Africa, the only country that really had a serious documented apartheid, is now bringing a case against genocide to the International Court of Justice. And it doesn't matter if the court does not rule a year and 10 months later that Israel committed genocide. Israel has committed genocide in the eyes of the public because the International Court of Justice had their kangaroo proceedings saying that Israel has committed genocide. And you have the International Criminal Court issuing arrest warrants for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Yoav Gallant on the basis of supposed war crimes. And so you see here that Israel's had to fight a physical war, they've had to fight a diplomatic war, and at the same time, there's actually, as Alan alluded to, there's the domestic war that's being fought inside Israel. That's a war that bubbled out onto the streets in the months before October 7th. Calmed down for a bit in the early months of the war when everybody was fighting together and people understood that there's an existential threat. But now, as the threats to the Israeli home front have been, largely removed, and the war in Gaza is still going on, but the threat to the Israeli home front has been significantly degraded, you're starting to see now that Israel's getting back into the domestic arguments and the political squabbling that kind of was a contributing factor that got Israel into this mess to begin with, that showed Hamas and others that Israel was particularly vulnerable. And what should Hamas think when they hear that reservists and Air Force pilots are saying, we won't show up to battle if there's a war? And Hamas said, look, these guys are vulnerable to attack. Maybe this is a good time. And the Prime Minister has had to deal with all of that, balancing his seat, trying to keep the country unified, dealing with the diplomacy, and dealing with the war, and at the same time is being forced to show up at a trial. Now the court just said this week that starting soon, the Prime Minister is going to have to show up 3 times a week for as many as 5 hours at a time for a trial in which the court has already told the prosecution that there's no case for bribery. That would represent the United States a mistrial. It would have been one of several mistrials because the court had already forced the prosecution to change their charge sheet 3 separate times. But meanwhile, the Prime Minister has had to deal with all of this simultaneously, and it's hard to, when you see him, it's hard to imagine that one man has so much on his shoulders. And I think that all of us can look at the job that he's doing and say, maybe he should have done this or maybe he shouldn't have done that. I think all of us do that. But that there's one person that's trying to deal with all of this, it's really something. I think it's incredible. And if you look back to the beginning of the war, the first thing that the Prime Minister did was galvanize support early on from Western leaders for the war. You remember Joe Biden came out to Israel, I believe, within the first 20 days. Even before that, at the time was Rishi Sunak was the Prime Minister of the UK. Emmanuel Macron came, Meloni from Italy. Was Starmer then the Chancellor of, who was the Chancellor in the beginning? Scholz was of Germany. All came to Israel in order for the Prime Minister he wanted to galvanize support for the war. And in the beginning, he had it. And why did he have it in the beginning? Because on October 7th, Israel was the victim. But soon enough, as Israel launched a ground attack into Gaza, Israel ceased being the victim, and now all of a sudden shifted back to the role that Hamas was prepared for, that the Palestinians have been laying the groundwork for, which is Israel as the oppressor. And what we've seen over time is that Western support for Israel's war has waned. And the Prime Minister maybe has made a big mistake in terms of assuming that that if you get the support in the beginning, that you would have the window of opportunity to continue fighting the war with Western support for the duration. Now, I would suggest that there are numerous reasons why the war has taken as long as it has. First, Israel was very hesitant to fight against multiple fronts simultaneously because that could really weaken Israel's ability on each front. It would tire out all of the reserves. There wasn't necessarily enough tanks, enough planes, enough weaponry. So in the beginning of the war, Israel's fighting against Hamas, but at a certain point, we saw how attacks from Hezbollah in southern Lebanon just continued to expand, and they were pummeling the north. And so Israel had to decide, wait a second, let's put this Gaza front on ice for a little bit. Now let's deal with Hezbollah. And they did that for a few months, and meanwhile leaving the Gaza arena steady as it was. Of course, we know that rescue operations for the hostages have not really proved successful. And the Prime Minister found a formula in negotiating for temporary ceasefires in exchange for hostages. Now, what that did is slow down the war, and also slowing down not only during the temporary ceasefire, but also during the negotiations towards these ceasefires. Another contributor to the slow fighting of the war was weapons supply. In the first months of the war, it can be said, and the Prime Minister and Minister Turmoil and others explained to me personally that while the Biden administration says they only withheld a single shipment of 2,000-pound bombs, that there's actually a laundry list of supplies that Israel had paid for and ordered that the United States was withholding from Israel because they didn't want them to use those weapons in Gaza. And what did it force Israel to do? Well, Israel is very ingenious, and if you can't do something one way, and the Prime Minister said, we'll fight with our fingernails if we have to, and that's almost what they did, because what the IDF had to do was to start going building by building. And instead of using air support in order to bomb booby-trap buildings, they had to basically fight a battle for each building. And then once the building was cleared, combat engineers would come and manually detonate the buildings. So they were going one by one by one by one through the Gaza Strip very methodically. And they did so fairly successfully, considering what they had to do. But it made the war take a long time. And then we saw, of course, how the theater changed towards Iran. The war was 12 days, but the run-up to that war and post-war lasted longer. And so here we are, a year and 10 months later, and we can see that the international community has really basically run out of patience with Israel. You see more and more how countries in Western Europe, including France and the UK, Canada, others saying that they will recognize the creation of a Palestinian state as the UN convenes in September, which will be the ultimate reward for the worst massacre against Jews in history since the Holocaust. The idea that these countries would just give a pass to the Palestinians for doing that and actually giving them what they want and showing the world that terrorism pays off, taking hostages pays off, Attacking innocent civilians in their homes on a Saturday morning on a Jewish holiday pays, because in the end of the day, you're just going to get what you wanted, because the international community is going to try to give that to you. Now, just because the international community says that there's going to be a Palestinian state doesn't mean that there's going to be one. To date, already 147 states have recognized the state of Palestine. That doesn't mean that there is one, and it doesn't mean that there's going to be one. And you might have a lot of Israelis that want to see the prime minister or this right-wing government replaced, but not one of them is lining up to give away Judea and Samaria, as well as Gaza, for the creation of a Palestinian state, because people understood that the formula was called land for peace, right? And we've gotten the opposite of peace. It's just the 20-year anniversary now of the withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. And I remember covering the withdrawal of Gaza. I was in Gaza several weeks before the withdrawal. I was in the northern Samaria communities of Chomesh and Sanor the very day before they were withdrawn from. And listening to the civilians, listening to military experts, all saying, this is going to be bad. This is going to be a national disaster. And here we are, 20 years later, living that national disaster that we set up, and having to deal with the consequences of that. And so people ask, what happened that Hamas was able to attack on October 7th. And there were certainly a lot of failings in the days before October 7th, in the hours before October 7th, in the year before October 7th, allowing Qatar to be funding Hamas inside Gaza for a few years. But let's remember, we had the IDF and 8,500 civilians inside Gaza 20 years ago when we decided that it would be a good idea to take every last Jew out of Gaza, and now we're paying the price for that. Now, I've had the privilege of privilege and responsibility of trying to make heads or tails out of what's going on in the media, and also following the Prime Minister through successive U.S. administrations. I was able to fly on the plane with the Prime Minister on 4 trips to the United States since the war started. Once when President Biden was just announcing that he was going to withdraw from the 2024 election. And he had meetings with Biden and Kamala Harris, and also with then Republican nominee Donald Trump in Mar-a-Lago, and gave that speech to Congress. I think the Prime Minister's spoken more before a joint session of Congress than any leader in U.S. history, in his stayed at the Blair House 14 times. I think more than any other leader in world history. Of course, when he was invited by the Biden administration, he was not invited to speak in the Blair House. He had to stay at the Watergate, and we remember reading about how buckets of maggots were dropped in the conference room where the Israeli team was conducting meetings over the course of that trip. I had front row seats at the speech to Congress, and then the Prime Minister came out of that speech and briefed the Israeli media. At that time, the big news was that he was calling for there to be a NATO-style alliance of Arab nations to deal with the Iranian nuclear threat. And sure enough, Israel had to deal with that threat by itself, not with the Arab neighbors. Of course, the United States participated in that. But one person that didn't have a front row seat for the Prime Minister's speech in Congress was Kamala Harris, who was on the campaign trail. She decided that she was not going to preside over that speech. It was the first and only time that she did not preside over joint sessions of the Congress. It was a very clear message that she left for the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister did then, 2 days later, meet with the President in the White House, and then later had a private meeting with Kamala Harris. Right after the meeting with Kamala Harris, the Prime Minister was escorted out of the White House. And after the Prime Minister was escorted out of the White House, Kamala Harris held a press briefing without the Prime Minister, in which she basically announced over 6 minutes how she had read the Prime Minister of the Riot Act. Now, immediately after that happened, all the Israeli press was summoned to the Watergate for an emergency briefing with senior Israeli officials, who were the most senior Israeli officials that could have been in the room at that time. And they expressed that Kamala Harris's press briefing did not look anything like the meeting that they had conducted. They said that the meeting was actually a very cordial meeting, that the vice president expressed some of her concerns, that the prime minister had expressed some of his concerns, and it was a very businesslike meeting. They didn't know that the vice president was going to do a press briefing immediately after the meeting between the two leaders, and that they were very disappointed with the tone of the speech and the contents, because it wasn't a reflection of what took place in their bilateral meeting. And the prime minister at that time expressed how dangerous it is when the United States and Israel project daylight between the two. That it's okay. I mean, they said it explicitly. They said it is very okay for the two administrations to have differences of opinions on how to deal with issues as sensitive as conducting a war. And those differences can, should, and must be expressed in private and hashed out. But when you come into public, you have to make it look like you are on the same page, because if you don't, you are basically giving a signal to Israel's enemies that the United States does not have Israel's back, and it makes the situation much more dangerous, and particularly as Israel was trying to negotiate the release of hostages. If Hamas and the Qataris feel like the United States is backing Israel, then you can try to get towards some kind of a negotiation. But if Hamas and Qatar feel like the United States is doing their own bidding, what does that do? It forces the price up in the negotiations. So, what the Prime Minister and senior Israeli officials were expressing was that they were actually making it much more difficult to negotiate the release of hostages. Now, of course, we know what happened in the election. And the moment that President Trump came into office, we saw a very different tenor in U.S.-Israel relations. And it's not just the president, it's also the Congress. Mike Johnson, as the Speaker of the House, on day one of the new administration said, we're going to sign on the dotted line and give Israel everything that they need. The president said the same. The prime minister was invited to be the first world leader to meet President Trump at the White House just 2 weeks after the president came into office. Look at that. The prime minister was invited to stay at the Blair House across the street from the White House. And it was at that meeting that the President of the United States, I think, surprised the Prime Minister and really everybody when he said that Gaza is a demolition zone and that all of the Gazans needed to be moved out, and that he would work, maybe with Jordan, maybe with Egypt. And then he said that the United States would take an ownership stake in Gaza. And in the Oval Office, the Prime Minister's like, you could see that the president was really like cooking policy in his own mind, but doing it out loud in front of all the cameras. And then there was a large press conference which was supposed to take place afterwards. And in one of the rooms on the east side of the White House, probably about the size of this room, there was about 150 reporters. And what was supposed to happen was there was going to be 2 American reporters that were going to be able to ask questions and 2 reporters from Israel that were going to be able to ask questions. I was one of the pre-selected reporters that was going to be able to ask a question of the president during that briefing. So it was supposed to be 4 questions. And sure enough, after the remarks by the president and the prime minister, the president says, "Okay, questions you." And then all of a sudden, the whole thing became a free-for-all. I never got to ask the question at that time in the briefing, but you saw then 2 weeks later when the King of Jordan came to the White House, and there was a lot of consternation on the faces of the Jordanian King Abdullah and on the president during that trip. That they were not pleased with the president's suggestion 2 weeks earlier that Jordan would absorb a number of Gazans. And in fact, we've seen even today that no country has absorbed Gazans, even though I just saw, maybe an hour ago, I saw that there were some Gazans may have arrived in Belgium, and I do know that there are some attempts right now to figure out how to move Gazans. People are saying to South Sudan, others have mentioned Libya as a possibility, others have mentioned Indonesia as a possibility of countries that could absorb Gazan citizens. And Gazan citizens have basically been denied the basic humanitarian right to flee the war zone. And if you've seen how before Israel was accused of genocide, how Israel is now being accused of starvation, the second the first Gazan leaves Gaza Strip, what's the accusation going to be? Ethnic cleansing. Okay, this is what we're facing. In April, the Prime Minister came back to the White House, and at that time, just a pool of reporters was invited inside the Oval Office. We thought it was just going to be a photo opportunity. In fact, I and the rest of the Israeli delegation got to spend over an hour inside the Oval Office together with the President and the Prime Minister. The President was extremely gracious with his time, answered questions, I think, from just about every reporter in the room who wanted to ask one. You know, I asked at the time if the President would consider demarcating the Palestinian Authority as a terrorist organization over their continuation of pay-for-slave payments, terror incitement, and financing payments to terrorists, those that are sitting in Israeli jails, and payments to the families of martyrs. The President didn't answer the question directly, but did speak over and over again about the plight of the Israeli hostages, how horrible it was what Hamas did, that the hostages are being treated in the most inhumane way. But what I can tell you is, from these visits, and including a visit that just took place last month in July, that the tenor of the relationship has changed. You could see that the President is really backing Israel to fight its war and to win its war, and understands that Hamas has to be defeated conclusively. And you see that the President hasn't been making the kind of statements that you were hearing from the Biden administration, statements that the President was making, or Antony Blinken, the former Secretary of State, was making, saying, yes, we support Israel's right to defend itself, but how it does so matters. That was the refrain from the Biden administration. The President's been telling Israel to go get the job done and to do it as fast as possible. And I've heard, I have firsthand reports from the White House that what the President's telling the Israeli Prime Minister to do is much more aggressive than what Prime Minister Netanyahu is willing to do. As far as the President's concerned, Israel should clear out the Gaza Strip and take it over. That's what the President told the When Bashar Assad fell as the President of Syria, the President told Prime Minister Netanyahu to take the southern third of Syria. He said to Israel over and over again, he says, your landmass is too small, you have no strategic depth, and you need more land. That's what the President is telling the Prime Minister. Now, the Prime Minister is balancing a lot of other issues. I at one point asked another very senior Israeli official, I said, well, if that's what the President's telling you to do, why aren't you doing that? And the answer was, well, our fighters have been fighting for over 350 days. And how are they going to tell their families now that they're being deployed to Syria? We don't know how long they're going to be there. You can take land, but then you have to hold it. It's not like the population in Syria, except for the Druze population, really wants them to be there. And not even all the Druze want them to be there. So you see that the Prime Minister has had to balance a lot. And meanwhile, we've got to the point, like I said, where the patience, and I think even patience in the White House is waning a little bit, because the President, he's saying, look, I told you to go win the war. Just do it. He said, do it as fast as you can, do it as conclusively as you can, and stop delaying, just because the situation is getting worse. And the President understands what we all understand, that the international media is not Israel's friend, that Western countries, including in Western Europe, that they're turning hard on Israel. We all saw the photos in the last few weeks in the New York Times and elsewhere, of the children with genetic diseases being passed off as starving children in Gaza. And somebody said to me yesterday, or it no, somebody earlier today said, you know, a picture's worth 1,000 words. That picture was worth $1 billion. I mean, it wasn't 1,000 words, that picture. And the New York Times knew that that child had genetic disease. In fact, I've even read articles about the conversations that took place between the editors, the communications that took place before they published that picture. And that wasn't even the first photo that they had chosen to use. And in fact, the first photo that they chose to use was another child with muscular dystrophy. And there was a whole back and forth about whether the editor should use a misleading photo and what that might do to the New York Times credibility. And in the end, they still used a photo of a child with a genetic disease. And ironically, some of these photos that have been spread around trying to pin, you know, Israel on creating starvation. And you know, if Israel was trying to starve Gaza, I don't think that starvation would have lasted for 1 year and 10 months. That's it's a little bit long to be starved. You know, you know, it's like after the whole genocide campaign was laid, you know, Israel says, you know, we've done more than any military in the history of warfare to reduce civilian casualties. And I'm not the one saying that. That's what John Spencer told me. He's the head of urban warfare at West Point. You know, going on and on about how what Israel's conduct in Gaza is going to be studied as the new gold standard for how a military fights against a terrorist organization in an urban setting, right? But that's called a genocide. And now you see Israel doing more than any country in the history of warfare to deliver humanitarian aid inside an enemy population, and Israel's being accused of starvation, right? And so this is kind of what we're dealing with. And again, this was Hamas's strategy from day one, and it didn't just happen on day one, right? The tunnels were not dug on October 6th. They were dug over a period of many years before. We see how the Qataris have been investing in the American universities for decades. Before then, the Saudis were doing it, by the way. The Saudis have since moderated their approach, but the Qataris saw what the Saudis were doing. And we see the effect that the Qatari funding in the universities has done to university students, especially at some of the liberal arts and Ivy League universities. And they've done the same thing in the media. Qatar puts close to $200 million a year into Al Jazeera, okay? And Al Jazeera has become one of the world's largest media organizations. The Palestinians themselves have approximately 19 news agencies, okay, that are reporting the numbers that the Gaza Health Ministry, an organ of Hamas, is putting out there and sending these pictures, you know, to Al Jazeera and others. But it's not just Al Jazeera, right? I told you about how Reuters and the AP, you know, put that story about the IDF, bombing the hospital. And it was back in 2021, the last time Israel was inside Gaza. Israel bombed the Hamas headquarters in Gaza City, and all of a sudden the entire world went berserk. Why? Because that same building that was the Hamas headquarters was the Associated Press headquarters. And you don't have to be very, very good at advanced mathematics to understand why the AP headquarters and the Hamas headquarters are in the same building. Okay? So you have a mainstream media industry, you know, that's led by Al Jazeera, and I say led because the New York Times, CNN, others, they take their cues in the morning from what they're reading in Al Jazeera. Okay, Al Jazeera is not operating in a vacuum. Okay, they're operating in the middle of an ecosystem. So you have a multi-billion-dollar mainstream media operation industry, of which the overwhelming majority of the Middle East and Israel-related coverage is specifically defaming and demonizing the state of Israel. And it's not just that, because now you see how all these articles in the mainstream are flying, being backed by the world's most powerful social media algorithms. And depending on the platform, you can see pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas messaging outpacing pro-Israel messaging by a clip of 10 to 1, you know, in the best of cases, all the way to 1,000 to 1 in TikTok and other cases, right? So you've got a multi-billion-dollar industry demonizing, defaming Israel. You've got the world's most powerful social media algorithms promoting anti-Israel messaging. And how's Israel combating that? You know, we know that Israel has a hard time with public relations, right? And there's a lot of different reasons why. I could do just an hour on that, and I'm not going to. But of course, you know, Jewish people, we have a hard time staying on message. We have a hard time agreeing on what the message is. We certainly don't stay on message. Right now, you've got former prime ministers of Israel stating that Israel's committing war crimes in Gaza. Okay, you have former heads of the military and the intelligence agencies, demonizing and criticizing Israeli government policy while the war is being fought, and they're doing it in mainstream media publications. So how are you supposed to win a PR battle when you're being undermined from within, right? But at the same time, we're also being dramatically outspent. If you take a look at all of the pro-Israel Jewish media outlets, that industry, and there's a number of publications, JNS isn't the only one, but if you take a look at this pro-Israel, supposedly pro-Israel Jewish media industry, what's the collective budget? We're talking like $100 million, $150 million, going up against a multi-billion-dollar industry. I mean, it's a David and Goliath fight. And then when you look at the that $100 million Jewish media mini industry, boutique industry, we'll call it. Unfortunately, a lot of those Jewish media outlets, and I'm happy to name names if you still want, but you probably know them. A lot of them are doing a tremendous disservice to the Jewish people because they, in the run-up to October 7th and during the election cycles, had already decided that it would be their goals to try to undermine the current government of Israel, to convince the Israeli public that they should vote for another candidate. Right? So you had, for example, the founding editor of the Times of Israel, David Horowitz, during the judicial reforms, wrote that, this is a direct quote in a headline in his front page editorial, Netanyahu truly aims to become King Bibi now. We must use all legal means to thwart him. Meaning that he's going to be using his publication as a platform in order to try to convince people to overthrow the democratically elected government. And in the beginning of the war, I would say that most of these Jewish outlets did a fair job in trying to defend Israel. But as the war is dragged on, you see how they've kind of reverted back to the partisan publishing that they were doing before the war, and to the extent that the Times of Israel just put out an op-ed this week saying that Israel's committing war crimes in Gaza. Okay, so if that's what the Jewish media is doing, to the extent where you actually see anti-Semites, posting on 4chan channels, and they're not sharing like German, articles, or like they're sharing articles from the Jerusalem Post and Haaretz and the Times of Israel saying, see, this is what I told you. JNS, what we're trying to do is to provide a counter narrative, first and foremost, or more directly to the Jewish media that I think are doing a tremendous damage to Israel's diplomatic standing and are harming the relationship between Israel and diaspora Jewry, because they're convincing everybody that Israel's a bad place because they don't like the prime minister of the government that's in power. And then on the flip side, we're trying to present the counter narrative to the Al Jazeera's and the other mainstream media. Now, last year we did that on a $5 million budget. Okay, this year our budget's growing. We'll be probably over $6.5 million by the end of the year. But we're trying to fight against a multi-million dollar, even multi-billion dollar industry. It's a David and Goliath fight. And we're willing to do it because we've read the Bible and we know that at the end of the day, David knocks Goliath out. But you still need, and we think that we will because we believe in the Jewish people, and we see that there's been tremendous blessings in the war. And it's hard to believe that, right? But the situation could have been much, much worse. Iran fired over 500 ballistic missiles at Israel. The number of people that died from 500 ballistic missiles was 29. I have to check the number. One missile, could have killed hundreds of people. Okay, remember that one that hit the hospital? You see the miracle that the hospital decided to clear out that one building, because they said if any one of the buildings we have is more vulnerable to a ballistic missile strike, it's this old building. And then they cleared that building out the day before that one building was hit by a ballistic missile. Okay, these are miracles. And if God had wanted Israel to be destroyed in this war, it could have happened and it would have happened. Okay, but we see time and again how God has shielded Israel from the type of damage that it could have faced, if God's protection over the Jewish people was not there. So there's a lot of good that's come out of it. The other incredible thing that's happened is we've really just trained the next generation of Jewish leaders. We've sent 300,000 plus people to look evil in the face and to do what they need to do, to fight a moral battle, not just for the survival of the state of Israel, but really a moral battle for the world, against Islamic extremism. And they've done it. They've done it with bravery, and they've also identified what are the problems in the thinking, in the upper echelons of the military, and in the upper echelons of the politics, where many of them are saying, hey, we're willing to risk our lives. We're willing to fight to the death to defend the land, but give us the green light. Don't tie two hands behind our back as we're fighting. And these are going to be the next political leaders of Israel. These are going to be the next generals of Israel. And so while the situation now, I think, does look very bleak, especially if you're connecting to it through the media, I think that ultimately Israel has a very bright future in front of it because of and as a result of this war. I think that the economy, which has certainly gotten hurt in terms of, let's say, the small business owners, many of whom have lost their businesses because they've been fighting for so long. But you don't see withholding of major investment into Israel. Quite the opposite. The shekel is very strong against the dollar right now, and I think it will continue to be strong. So I'm hoping that the long-term future of Israel is bright. The short-term future, it's going to be difficult. We're going to be in election soon. I think that's probably likely to bring out some of the worst, again, in society. Why? Because it's being fueled by the media, being fueled by partisan petty politics. And there's a reckoning that needs to take place over what happened on October 7th, and that's going to play itself out in the upcoming election. But in the election after the next election, I think you're going to see a major political shift in the country. And ultimately, I would say, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been a generational leader, and there will be a next generational leader. I don't think it comes from the 120 members of the current Knesset, but we'll see who those people will be, because quite frankly, we've seen some of the best of Israeli citizens in these last 2 years. Israel's just filled with really some incredible people, so smart, so talented, so dedicated, so I'm hoping that we will overcome the physical battle. Hopefully we will figure out how to get by this diplomatic battle. The formula for that is getting this war over with as soon as possible, because we know that the media is very ADHD, and there's going to be another crisis. But we've got to get out of this crisis and let the media get to the next crisis, and stop coming back to Gaza. Like, Gaza just got to get out of the headlines in order for us to move to a better footing. And also, we're going to have to be very careful to avoid some of the trappings of the domestic battles that are upcoming in the next election. And we should try, to whatever degree, to remain unified, even among all of our differences, because the Jewish people, when they are united, they are strong. And when they are divided, they are very vulnerable. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. That's a lot of information to digest. I do have just a couple of questions first, then we'll open it to Q&A from people in the audience. This has become so complicated basically because of the hostages. Tell us a little bit about the organizers of the Hostage Forum in Israel. What is that?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. In the we had 5 consecutive elections in Israel in a very short, in a 5-year period, which is, 4 too many elections to happen in a 5-year period. And we started to see organized protests during those elections. In fact, the first elections were held during COVID. And we had pretty strict regulations in Israel at that time, and you weren't allowed to go more than 500 meters from your house, except to go to the supermarket or the doctor's office or an anti-Netanyahu protest, which was a protected event. In fact, I personally went to several protests just to get out of the house. said to my wife, "Oh, I got to go cover this protest. I'll be over there." And what you saw during those protests was a lot of signage, a lot of slogans, T-shirts, billboards, and you saw that the media was really like a partner in promoting the protests. And the protest movement picked up steam. And then, sure enough, after Prime Minister Netanyahu won that 5th election stunningly and formed a right-wing majority government, and then they introduced judicial reforms, you saw the same organizers of these, let's say, prime minister protest movement become what was later called the Kaplan Force and organize even much larger scale protests. And it was the largest funded protest movement, certainly in Israeli history. And even in terms of like Western protest movements, you were talking about tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars went in to fund these protest movements. And the second the war broke out on October 7th, you saw the same organizers of these Kaplan Force protests immediately form the hostage forums. And they did it for 2 reasons. First is they needed to restore some credibility with the Israeli public, many of whom were holding this Kaplan Force responsible for trying to tear the country apart and for demonstrating that Israel was vulnerable to an attack. And they lost a lot of credibility. But the second is that they hedged on day one when 255 people were taken hostage that you wouldn't succeed to bring back the hostages. And in fact, that's why they focus tested different messaging, and the slogan behind the hostage movement became "Bring them home." Right? It wasn't "Let them go." And the reason why the slogan was called "Bring them home," and all of us have said "Bring them home," we wore the pins. But the reason why that was chosen as the slogan was because the hostage forum, these anti-Netanyahu ad agencies and others that were behind this, were hedging that they would be able to say for months, if not years, that Netanyahu failed to bring them home. Okay? We just saw this week how now you're seeing the protest movement come up again. And what they're saying is that they want the prime minister to agree to a deal that would end the war and bring all the hostages home. Now, I think that the prime minister would sign a deal to end the war and bring all the hostages home. The problem is that the prime minister is not negotiating with his cabinet. Okay, he's negotiating with Hamas, and Hamas has no incentive to release the remaining hostages. And I think it took the prime minister a long time to figure out, and it took the president of the United States a long time to realize that with only 20 hostages left, that there's no incentive for Hamas to release these hostages, because the second they release the hostages, they don't have an ace up their sleeve anymore. But meanwhile, it's this hostage forum that was led by the anti-Netanyahu government protest, which, by the way, has been aided by the fact that the October 7th attacks, most of them struck at the heart of these left-wing kibbutzim on the border. So it was very easy for the family members of those taken hostage from those communities to join in with the hostage forum, because they didn't vote for Netanyahu, and they wanted Netanyahu out before, and they certainly want him out now. But it's very important to understand that this movement has been co-opted, and it's unfortunate, because I think really every Israeli wants to see Hamas let the hostages go.
And of course, the leaders of France and the UK and Spain and Australia are not helping anything as far as getting the hostages released, because Hamas believes, hey, we're going to get a state from this, we'll keep them, no problem.
Yeah, I mean, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think even more damaging for Israel than the idea that these countries would recognize a Palestinian state, a mythical Palestinian state that's not going to exist anytime soon, is that you see that, like Starmer, for example, in Germany has withheld now shipments of weapons to Israel, and I think it's a big threat of there being a major arms embargo on the state of Israel. And we even saw how the Biden administration was slow walking weapons and threatening to withhold weapons. Now, President Trump is going to give Israel whatever they say they need over the next short period, which is great. But you have to remember that this is a president now in his second term. He's not going to be the president next. If there's going to be a pendulum swing back the other way, we almost had Kamala Harris be president, and certainly if Kamala Harris would have been the president, you would not have seen the free flow of weapons that you've seen. And we're not talking about domestic politics. I'm only talking about the flow of weapons. You wouldn't have seen the same flow of weapons to Israel that you see under President Trump. But aside from the swing that we've seen in the Democratic Party, which has become more and more progressive on the left, you have in the Republican Party this very dangerous isolationist fringe that has risen up fairly quickly, trying to suggest that Israel, and particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu, is the tail wagging the dog and the one trying to drag the United States into wars that Americans don't want to be in. Now, I would have thought that when Israel succeeded in 12 days to take out the Iranian nuclear facilities, and the United States participated with their Operation Midnight Hammer and dropped the 12 MOP massive ordnance penetrators on Fort Dow and on Natanz without losing a plane, without putting one boot on the ground, that these isolationists would have said, okay, you guys were right and that was great, but they haven't said that. And we don't know who will be the next Republican nominee, but there's a good case, I think there's a reasonable fear, rather, that even if a Republican becomes president after Trump, whether that's Vice President Vance or someone else, that they may not be as pro-Israel as the current president. Now, the Prime Minister's invested a lot of time and energy into his relationship with the Vice President. On each of the 3 trips that I joined the Prime Minister made sure to have a meeting privately with the Vice President. So if Vance is the Republican nominee, and if he were to become the successor to President Trump, there's a good chance, especially if he keeps some holdovers like Marco Rubio, Pete Hegseth, as members of a successive administration, that Israel could have that kind of pro-Israel support. But I think that the message for Israel is loud and clear. You cannot depend on support from any government in the world, specifically for the supply of weapons. So it's going to be incumbent on Israel to do what they need right now, as quickly as possible, while President Trump is still in office, and hopefully while Mike Johnson remains the Speaker of the House, to stockpile as much as you can, as fast as you can, but at the same time to be developing your own weapons capabilities.
That's the key.
Because you should never count on any other country for your defense.
Caroline Glick, who has spoken here a couple of times, who's now a minister or something with an advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu, in her book clearly states that it was a big mistake giving up our own defense industry, and that needs to come back, which it is.
And by the way, if you're looking for good investments into Israel, there's going to be billions of dollars invested into Israeli defense technologies in the aftermath of this war. So that might be a good place to invest. And I just will note that Caroline Glick was selected to be an advisor in the Prime Minister's office from JNS.
Absolutely. Now, an important question. There's so much talk now with the present administration here in our country about the movement to extend sovereignty to Judea and Samaria, it would have met with far more opposition until October 7th. Where are we now with respect to extending sovereignty?
Well, I think Israel's up against the wall here with all of these countries that are stating that they're willing to recognize a Palestinian state. And the current status quo in which the Palestinian Authority territories in Judea and Samaria are not under full Israeli sovereignty. I know that the Prime Minister was very hesitant to adjust that status quo for many, many years. But if the West, and specifically countries that Israel considered to be its allies, are now going to turn around and say that that territory is officially Palestinian, I think that Israel has to think very carefully about whether it is going to be willing to extend its sovereignty over that territory and put to bed the idea that there could be a Palestinian state on that territory. I think that the Prime Minister is probably the furthest left-wing member of his own coalition right now. Like if you would take Netanyahu out and just have vote among the remaining Likud members and some of the other members of the coalition, they would vote overwhelmingly to apply Israeli sovereignty in Judea and Samaria. I think that the Prime Minister, Minister Dermer, and others will be much more hesitant to do so.
Now, you held a very impressive conference in Jerusalem a couple of months ago, and I'd just like you to watch this video, if we can set the video,
We'll do that.
this one going, and then we will open up to questions from the floor. I was not able to make this conference, but it will happen again next year from JNS. And for those of you with this kind of interest and the importance of what's going on in Israel, you can't miss this conference with the really heavy hitters in journalism and politics and the Israeli government and business leaders. It really was an incredible conference to watch. Can we get that going?
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the inaugural JNS International Policy Summit. At this two-day summit, you will hear over 120 voices from those who have been fighting for Israel and the Jewish people. They will present here the ideas, concepts, and most importantly, policies that will help chart a new course to steer the Jewish people through the current challenges and into a better, stronger, and more secure future.
It is a life commitment, a lifetime of commitment to see to it that against all obstacles, against all foes, and hand in hand with all friends, that Israel thrives, that each Israeli thrives.
I really believe that their work and all of the mission that the people deserve security, safety, and sovereignty over the land that God gave them 3,500 years ago. If there ever was a time that the city of Jerusalem should be absolutely recognized as the indisputable, undivided capital of the Jewish people, it is now.
During the wartime, I think it speaks a lot. We are not alone. Sometimes we think that everyone is against us. It's not the case. We have allies. We have friends. They should be more vocal. They should speak up more, but we are not alone.
not to cover before our enemies do, not to cover before lies that are spread here and there, undercover, to stand up and fight back. We fight back with the truth. So I ask you to continue to fight for the truth.
I do want to mention and make sure you understand, most media outlets are for profit. JNS is non-profit. It is a 501c3, and to help support it, at least to me, is extremely important. You see how much information we've heard here today, and that's the kind of information, unbiased, that we get from Jewish News Syndicate, and there's information on your seats in the back. Please consider that. Finally, let's open it up to questions, and please, I beg of you, make it a question as opposed to a commentary, okay? Quick question.
Thanks, Alan. Wonderful, thank you so much. What is the essence of the political opposition to Netanyahu?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think when you go down to the essence, it is a question of what the future of the state of Israel is going to look like. And you have, basically, I mean, it's generally speaking a secular left in Israel, that sees itself as being the ones that built the country, formed the government, laid the electricity lines, paved the streets, and ultimately, what they want is for Israel to be seen as an extension of Western Europe on the Eastern Mediterranean. And Netanyahu, I think he's really a centrist. I mean, he certainly has, the historical context from his father, who was a great historian, and has an appreciation of Jewish history and an appreciation of Jewish tradition, but himself, not really very religious, maybe getting just a little bit more religious in the last couple of weeks, as he's gone to the Western Wall a few times before and after the war in Iran. But basically, the political left, and it happens here in America also, they often spit their own leaders out. And they thought in the 90s that they had spit Netanyahu out. And then Netanyahu came back, and Netanyahu always preferred to govern from the center, always with right-wing parties, with left-wing parties, because he felt that was the way that he could have the greatest legitimacy and backing for his governments. But we saw slowly, and this began with Avigdor Lieberman and then Bogi Ya'alon and others, when people defected away from Netanyahu, Netanyahu looked at the political map and realized that he could remain in power if he would form a government with Israel's religious right. Okay? And when you sit in government, look, most of the Israeli budget, let's say, the governmental budget, let's call it fixed, right? There's certain expenses for the military, for the universities, for the hospitals. There's not too much wiggle room there. But then you've got all the fringes of the budget, which can either, on the one hand, go to cultural things, on the left maybe, or to religious things on the right, or to go to build settlements, or to go to fund whatever it's funding on the other side. And so as Netanyahu sat with the right, now you see all the fringes of the budgets going towards the religious, going towards the settlers. You're seeing how the demographics of the country are shifting to the extent that this majority right-wing government is not an aberration. The country's moving to the right. In fact, post-October 7th, the country's moving further to the right. And so, for the left wing, they see what Netanyahu's done, and he's basically empowering the right wing to rule the country. And so I think that's really It's really what this is about. And there's a culture war, and on the left wing, the left wing in Israel, they control the courts, they control the upper echelons of the military, they control the intelligence agencies, they control the media, they control the legal system, they control.
That's enough.
Yeah. And so, but the right wing now controls the government. And so you're seeing this battle here, and that's why, when Netanyahu wanted to try to reform the court, and now you see how he's trying to reform the upper echelons of the intelligence agencies and the military, that for the left, this is an existential crisis. And that's why they would be willing to, almost tear the country down, because they think that if the right wing, that if Smotriches and Ben Gvirs take over the government, that it's not a country worth fighting for. And that's ultimately, I think, what's the essence of the opposition to Netanyahu.
Just a quick answer, because so many of us in this room misunderstand, because we think that the religious young men do not serve in the IDF at all. Can you please correct that?
Well, first of all, the one sector of society that's lost more combat soldiers per capita than any other sector has been national religious. Okay, so you have within religious, you have national religious, and they're sending their kids to the army, and they're going to the front lines of combat. Then, of course, you have the Haredi, and for lots of different reasons that were created by political exceptions granted all the way back by David Ben-Gurion when there was much less ultra-Orthodox men, and they really weren't needed. You have these precedent situations set up whereby Haredi men don't serve. And now you have politicians in the ultra-Orthodox community who are, many of them in their 80s and their 90s, that are all about preserving power, and they don't want to see their yeshivas lose funding, and they don't want to see their young men go into an army which is largely a secular army, which they fear that if religious men go into it, that they will come out not being religious at the end, okay, which is a valid concern. And to be frank, probably, there are many elements that run this secular left-wing army that don't want to make the accommodations to allow religious men to come in and to maintain their lifestyle. But of course, there's a crisis, and people feel that there is the this burden of equality, and it's not only in the military; it's also in the economy. But we are seeing much more than a trickle of young men, even from the ultra-Orthodox sectors of society, now willing to go into the military. There's a new unit called Chashmonaim, which is now fighting on front lines. They just had some of their first deaths just a few weeks back, and I've met some of these guys, and they're really remarkable young men. And I think it's just a matter of time. And quite frankly, I would say we need more religious people in the army, not because religious people need to share the burden of service, but because you need to have soldiers in the state of Israel that have read the Tanakh, that understand when they're standing in Shechem outside of Joseph's tomb, that they don't see a city called Nablus and saying, what the heck are we doing here? Or looking at 500 really brave residents living within meters of the cave of the patriarchs in Hebron, and thinking that they're rabble-rousers, rather thinking that they're brave Jews, and that we need to defend them, and we need to defend these holy sites. So, ultimately, I think it's going to be to Israel's benefit for the ultra-Orthodox to come in. And quite frankly, when they come in, and they come in big numbers, they're going to change the entire fabric of the military.
Sal, is JNS has a presence in Europe, and if not, is there an equivalent of JNS that does? And do you think that Europe, at least on a governmental level, is lost, or that there's a possibility that Israel regain European support?
We do have several journalists in Europe. Leading that charge for us is Fiamma Nierenstein, who's one of the bravest voices fighting for Israel in Italy nonstop. But we have some reporters in the UK and freelancers we work with in France and elsewhere. Look, there's a culture war taking place everywhere. There's a culture war taking place in Israel. There's a culture war taking place in the United States, and there's a major culture war taking place in Europe. I was with the Prime Minister when he went to Hungary, which is really the only country or one of the only countries that the Prime Minister can safely touch down in Europe without fear of being arrested. Okay, and he met with Viktor Orban, who's been very, very strong ally of the Prime Minister and of the State of Israel. And when I was there, I interviewed Balázs Orban, who's the political director. He's not related, by the way, to Viktor Orban, but he's a rising star in Hungarian politics. And he told me, and we've seen this, that there are battles being fought for every country. Emmanuel Macron is a lame duck president in France right now. He's not going to be the president for long. And there's a possibility that you could see a conservative swing in France. There's a possibility that you could see a conservative swing in the UK and elsewhere. So the problem is that, democracy, it has its virtues, but it's also prone and proving itself to be prone to these dramatic pendulum swings. So if you would have a conservative, like, before, let's say, Liz Truss, Theresa May in the UK, they were staunch allies of the State of Israel, right? So, it really depends on who's in power, but that's still a short-term question, because in the long term, we understand the reasons why Macron and Starmer and others are turning against Israel, and it's because of demographics. And the Muslim vote is worth a lot more to those leaders today than the Jewish vote is. And so, while there could be a short-term pendulum swing, you have to ask yourself the long-term question of, is Western Europe lost? Right? You see what's going on in the UK and elsewhere. And I was very impressed to see how Hungary and Poland and some of the other countries, who might not be the countries that we want to be our greatest allies, but they've stood up against mass Muslim illegal immigration into their countries and are protecting their borders and protecting their nationalist culture. And we have to see, these movements are taking place, like Wilders in Netherlands and elsewhere. There are some pretty brave conservatives trying to fight for the souls of their countries in Europe.
Thank you very much for this wonderful speech, or presentation, I should say. I have a global question for you, and I'm a news junkie. I read you. I read Reuters. I read New York Times. I read a lot. I would like your opinion when you come into an audience and people cheer one way or the other. Oh, New York Times. Oh, this one bad. Oh, this one good. As a journalist, there's a sub-question. What do you think about that? Do you read everything, or you just narrow scope?
I think it's, for me, I'm trying to read everything, because, when I interviewed Ron Dermer at the summit, you saw that, I asked him a question about, what percentage of what he reads in the media would he say is an accurate reflection of what's actually happening behind closed doors? And he's told me in the past that maybe 30%. And the problem is you don't know which 30% is true, right? You don't know which is the 30%. So it's a problem. But he said, and I agree with this, he said, oftentimes he finds himself reading the media not to know what's going on, but to know what people are saying is going on, so he knows how to respond to what people think is actually going on. So, I've said, to some people that, what I do is I work in like a toxic waste dump, and I have to sift through a tremendous amount of filth and rocks and dirt, looking for the nuggets that are truthful, the ones that need to be magnified, and also looking for those talking points which need to be counterbalanced in real time. And that's what our staff does, and we're just combing the media as it's happening and putting out the counter narrative on the one, on the other, coming out with original information that other media organizations don't have access to, so that we're actually the ones driving certain stories. Like just a couple weeks ago, when we had information about a top staffer in the Pentagon who was making anti-Semitic posts on his social media, and we were the first ones to report that, and then all the other media started, including Drudge Report and others, linking to our reporting, and within 48 hours we got that staffer fired because of those reports. So on the one hand, it's countering the bad information. On the other hand, it's putting out the important narratives and being first. And then on the other hand, it's working with an entire network of pro-Israel organizations to help them accomplish their missions, what they're trying to do. And then also working with politicians, which we do on a very regular basis, to plant the articles that are needed to sway public opinion, and more importantly, to get certain policies or ideas, actually passed into law, either as legislation or executive order. So it's important to read the other media, and it's also important to have your own identity and come out with your own original reporting.
We can listen to Alex for the next 3 or 4 hours easily. Such knowledge and really helping us understand better the truth of what's going on in Israel locally, and of course with this war. Please come up with your questions. We just have to stop because it's getting late enough. It's almost 6:45. Alex, JNS is so important. Please help support JNS as well. Thank you so much for coming and for taking so long to get here. Thank you all.